Okay, let's look at sort of the history of how art is related to the mind and science and psychology before you think I'm like totally crazy. So we're still in the creative process and we're looking at the neurographic portrait, and now we're looking at the art and the mind. So let's just have a look at throughout history how science and psychology has been integrated with art. So you don't think I'm totally crazy about why we're doing this this project, because there is a purpose to it. For this course, we're looking at a lot of art that's recently been made, and recently means starting about 100 years ago. Our focus is going to be on the stuff that's done mostly within the past 20 years, but we have to start somewhere. So let's just have a look at some of the things that happened sort of about 100 years ago to give us insight about why we have the art that we do today. Okay, so we're looking right now at how art and the mind are related. So let's move my face over here. Okay, perfect. So about 100 years ago, give or take a little bit, there's a few things that really happened. There's a lot of things that really happened in the world that really affected the way that art was made, and that gave birth to all the cool things that we have right now, even like graffiti and street art and conceptual art and digital art and all the really neat stuff that we have. And it made the transition from things like traditional art, where things are painted realistically all the time, and that's where you get the respect, to this modern kind of weird stuff that's kind of hard to understand, and it's not necessarily about showing off your skills, but more about the thought that's behind it, okay, and emotions and feelings and how the mind works. So a lot of things happened about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit more. One, there was the invention of photography. So with the invention of the camera and more people having access to a camera, it kind of put artists out of a job, right? Why would you pay somebody to sit and do a portrait of you when you could take a picture of somebody and that picture would be much quicker, much less expensive, and much more exact, right? So, and that kind of, that was one of the main jobs for being an artist. So it kind of took away some of their art, right? And same with like landscapes and things like that. And so it actually, photography has become its own art form. So that really changed about, artists started thinking about, okay, well, how am I going to be an artist? Why am I going to paint, right? Why am I going to draw? Something else that happened major, there's 2 world wars, right, that happened in the 1900s, and especially the First World War really had a huge impact especially in European artists, where a lot of this sort of modern art was created, because when you go out and paint these beautiful landscapes, and the goal was to be realistic in your use of color and capture everything, when there's a war going on, why would you want to go out and paint those things about humanity and the destruction that they were causing, right? So like just mentally, and you can understand with this right now with COVID going on, like mentally, how could you sit there and just paint this beautiful picture of the world when things just don't seem right? So artists started painting more about their emotions and how they were feelings, and these sort of awful sort of alternative views of what the world really looked like. So that changed art. So they no longer could just sit there and paint pretty pictures that look realistic, and they became more abstract and a little strange. And another huge impact around 1900, a little bit earlier, was this invention of psychology, just understanding how the mind works, and in a few ways understanding how human beings respond to shapes and colors. So that's a way for them to express their emotions. So instead of art always being about something about, this is a painting of a person, or this is a painting of a bird, this example here is a painting of a song, of a piece of music, right? So art became symbolism for these deep emotions and these deep feelings, and understanding about other things that are going on in our brain. So that study of how the brain works, there are a lot of different methods to kind of tap into different parts of our brain, different ways human beings were thinking, and one of those things was through art. So there's 2 main people that that really influenced this revolution. Of course, there's way more, psychologists in this, but one of the main dudes was this guy named Sigmund Freud, and another guy named was Carl Jung. Now, to base this on, for these psychologists, is that looking at human beings and how they use symbols, and we've always, used symbols throughout our whole lives, right? I know, like in the 1850s, 1900s, not everybody was literate and able to read. So I know a lot of the signs, they would just have a picture symbolizing of what the store was. So if you were a shoemaker, you wouldn't necessarily have like a sign that says shoemaker on it. You would have a picture of a shoe, things like that. We can think about Egyptian hieroglyphics. They didn't really necessarily have an alphabet, but it was very, the hieroglyphics they were using was picture-based to sort of mean different things, right? So even today, right, there's non-smoking signs, there's washrooms, there's stairs, there's danger signs, right? It's like these symbols that we use all the time that are supposed to transcend sort of language barriers, and we sort of understand, the meaning without actually having any words. So psychologists like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in their early stages of psychology really focused on the use of symbols that human beings were making, and they were interpreting these symbols that came through people, that either came in, they came through people in people's dreams, or when they were sort of in this unconscious state, like a dreamlike state, like when you're like meditating, you do that with yoga. When you're daydreaming, that's the best way, when you're sort of like sitting in class and you're listening to the teacher, right? But you're not really paying attention. Your brain is somewhere else. You're awake, but you're not really there, right? Your mind is somewhere else. So these psychologists were tapping into the symbols that came into your brain through your dreams, or when you're like daydreaming. Okay, so one of the cool guys, the cool theories of Carl Jung, and was about these symbols and how they were used, and he actually shaped a whole bunch of different sort of art movements. So follow me here. This is like a brief overview of what these guys believed in. And I mean, I could go on and on and on, and maybe you've even studied some of these in some of your psychology classes. So Carl Jung believed that there are these images in our brain called archetypes. So the theory for him was that just as our body has an evolutionary history, like we have a DNA and we've evolved, from the beginning of time, our mind evolves as well. And part of that evolution is imprinted in our brain in something called a collective unconscious. So this is a place where all like images and symbols are all stored that have come from the beginning of when human beings existed, and it's connected to our instincts and our different stages of development. So we inherit these symbols from generations and generations, and we can see these symbols through different dreams and our behaviors, and from things that we draw when we're like daydreaming. So follow me here. Carl Jung believed as a human being, what makes you, what makes your brain is, one, your consciousness. So when you're like right now, when you're awake, you're aware of your surroundings, you're learning, you understand what's going on. The other level of what makes you and how your brain works is your personal unconscious. So maybe, different memories of your life that are stored in your brain, and different experiences, good or bad, that have impacted you, that impact your behavior and how you relate to the world. And the last part is this collective unconscious. So all of these different instinctual behaviors and different symbols that we've inherited since the beginning of human beings existing, right? They're in our brain deep there somewhere, and they do make up us who we are. They make us human too. Okay, now that you think I'm really crazy, let me try and explain it a bit more. in nature, we see this symbol of the spiral everywhere. We see them in galaxies, we see them in plants, we see them in shells, we see them in storms, the way the water goes down the toilet even. It's this natural symbol that occurs in nature. And human beings, regardless of when they existed, from the cave people, prehistoric people who had no written language, no verbal language even, they drew symbols on their rocks of spirals. Doesn't matter where in the world that they lived, they drew these spirals. We see spirals in designs in clay pots. It doesn't matter what culture, it doesn't matter where they existed, but these spirals show up. Why? Even in modern art, when we talk about the Renaissance, that happened about 500 years ago when the Mona Lisa was painted. She was painted according to this theory of this golden ratio. This was such a big scientific theory about when you paint human beings, and it was a spiral. Even in modern art, Vincent van Gogh, when he painted this painting, the sky is using all these spirals. Even today in modern times, when we design our architecture, we have these spirals. So why do we keep using these spirals, and where do they come from? Well, this is Carl Jung was very much in the beginning stages of psychology and the development, the understanding of the mind. And there's a lot of theories that probably were very strange and maybe wrong, and a lot of practices that they did that were horrible and wrong. But there is some truth to this. So human beings, when they start drawing, there's like all of these markers and all these different stages of what from little kids when they start drawing that they go through, and they seem to be the same regardless of where they live, like what their cultural background is, etc. That sort of come up. And one of the basic ones is simple shapes, and those are all the building blocks for building letters, and goes to crosses, and then more complicated shapes, mandalas, and these suns and these radial images, and how they build people. So all of these things sort of are in these stages. And one of those things is that kids draw spirals. And how do they know to draw spirals? And where do these images come from? Because again, they can't write, they can't read at this point, right? But yet they can still sort of like describe stories and feelings and emotions and understand the world around them through these different symbols. So what Carl Jung believed is that there are a variety of different symbols. I've just given you one, which is the spiral, and I could go on and on and on. There's tons of different archetypes or symbols that all human beings throughout time, regardless of culture, where you live, when you live, anything, that we seem to always keep repeating. And one of them is spirals, and there's a whole bunch more. This spawned a whole bunch of different art movements. And one of the art movements that it spawned was one called Dada, which is like complete. Dada actually means nonsense. It's a complete nonsense art form where when you create a piece of art in Dada, you are daydreaming. You're not pre-planning what you want to do. So it seems very childlike. But the idea is that you kind of meditate and you kind of just like draw these basic shapes in these images, and then afterwards you kind of look at it and you analyze it. Another form that kind of was an offspring of sort of Dada is this automatism art movement, or this automatic drawing, where you kind of get into this meditative state, and then you just have your pen and your paper, and you just let your hand just go, and you're just drawing all these different sorts of things, and you don't know what's going to happen. Nothing is pre-planned, but the idea is that your collective unconscious, your daydreaming part, your deepest part of the brain that's connected with all of humanity, is drawing these weird images. And then later on, you're sort of comparing them to other people, and you're analyzing them. Okay, so that's sort of the gist of how Carl Jung influenced artists for different movements, and why some of the modern art that you look at going, this is weird. But it's based on the invention of psychology and some of the theories of Carl Jung. Now, there was another guy, Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud, he was similar to Carl Jung in a lot of ways, but what he sort of focused his psychology in a little bit more is the symbols that come through your dreams. So if you ever have, those weird dreams about, I don't know, you're floating, or your hands are itchy, or, your teeth hurt, or things like that. The idea is that you have a dream, you wake up in the morning, you write it down, and then you have those dream analysis books where you look at, okay, what does it mean if my hands are itchy? What does it mean that my teeth are tingling, or that I'm floating, right? And some of them are supposed to mean, well, if I'm not sure, but, if you're dreaming that you're floating, it means this and this and this, or if your teeth hurt, or if your hands are tingly, then maybe you're going to come into money, but that was sort of the idea, is that when you are in a deep, relaxing, dreamlike state, that's when your brain is sort of working some things out, and then it will, if you analyze all the things that are happening in your brain, then you can analyze those things, and it can reveal some things about you and your life. So he inspired a whole really cool art movement called surrealism, which is really neat. Now this looks much different because it looks realistic, right? It's realistically painted. So it looks traditional, like the Mona Lisa. It's not weird, like this weird abstract kind of automatic stuff. But if you look at it, it's kind of creepy, right? It's like, it looks like a dream. It's like it's painted like realistically, like this could exist, but it couldn't really exist. Just like in your brain, when you're having a dream that you're flying, it really feels like you're flying, right? But you know that it's impossible for you to fly, but you have that feeling of it flying, right? So, but that idea of you flying sort of symbolizes something. So artists like Salvador Dali and a bunch of surrealists sort of played with this. So if you look closely at it, it looks, like a barren landscape, and you've got 3 swans sort of floating in the water. But if you look at it a different way, you can actually see the reflection is actually some elephants, and it sort of plays some tricks with your mind and your brain and just reality. Okay, so all of these, these 2 psychologists are one of the main influences on changing art from traditional into more modern, and just sort of a different focus of what art could be. And mostly because artists and human beings were facing a different reality in the world around 1900, so their art reflected that. So our focus then is going to be looking at the art and the mind for this next assignment. Okay, so let's go give it a shot.